Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to our Thursday morning briefing series. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Director's Office here at DGAP, and it is my great pleasure to be chairing this morning's briefing. Today, we are looking at the US elections. Tuesday's presidential debate, of course, the two campaigns, their promises and policies, especially their foreign policies, and how all of this affects us across the Atlantic. Less than 8 weeks from the election, things could hardly be any more tense. The latest polls suggest a slight lead for Vice President Kamala Harris in some swing states, including Wisconsin and Michigan, but the race remains essentially too close to call. Regardless of who wins in November, transatlantic relations are bound to change. And so we want to ask if Europe is prepared for what's to come, and if not, what's left to be done. We will look at the debate, of course, but also at the campaigns more generally to get an idea of how American politics is changing. We'll do some speculation about the weeks ahead and the election outcomes, and crucially, we will talk about transatlantic relations. To do so, we have an excellent panel lined up today. First is Dr. Brian Klaas, who is Associate Professor at University College London and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. He is the author of several books, including The Despot's Apprentice, Donald Trump's Attack on Democracy, which came out in 2017. And he regularly comes in major outlets, including the New York Times, The Guardian, and Foreign Affairs. Brian is originally from Minnesota and holds a doctorate from Oxford. Great to have you, Brian. Next will be Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, who is, since the 15th of August, the director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and who was previously the Guido Goldman Distinguished Scholar for Geostrategy at the German Marshall Fund, GMF. He was the head of the Berlin office for many years and previously started out as a journalist with the German weekly Die Zeit, including, amongst others, as their DC bureau chief. From 2013 to 2017, Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff was advisor and speechwriter for Federal President Joachim Gauck. Glad to have you, Thomas. Last but certainly not least is Rachel Tausendfreund, who joined the German Council on Foreign Relations in September this year as a senior research fellow on the US and transatlantic relations. Previously, Rachel worked also at GMF as a senior fellow in geostrategy and was from 2015 to 2022 their editorial director. Welcome, Rachel. Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. We would like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We'll kick off our conversation here on the panel with about 5 minutes of intro remarks each, and then open up for questions after about 30 minutes or so. If you would like to ask a question during the Q&A, please raise your hand, virtually or otherwise, and when invited to speak, briefly introduce yourself and keep your questions or comments relatively short so we can pick up as many as possible. Finally, just a word of thanks to my colleagues supporting this morning briefing series, Milan Nitsch, Henning Hoff, Julia Löwer, Helga Beck, and many others. So without much further ado, over to you, Brian. Can you kick us off by saying a few words about the campaigns and about how American political culture is changing? Is the fierce tone that we've heard in the debate on Tuesday the new normal?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for hosting me. It is a crazy campaign. I mean, there's no way other than that to describe it. There has been a switch of candidates in an unprecedented way, an assassination attempt. And, a day and a half ago, we had the former president falsely claim that immigrants are eating dogs and cats in American cities. So, the state of the race is one that is extremely close. But I think the bigger picture, and this is the sort of overtone of the remarks that I often make, is that the state of the race being close suggests that American democracy has something fundamentally broken about it. And the reason I say that is because you have someone who is a 34-time convicted felon, who has been found liable for sexual assault, who is not legally allowed to open even a hot dog stand in his home state of New York because his businesses committed fraud. And he still might become president again. He still might get reelected. And so, there's something fundamentally wrong with a country in which that is possible. And so why is that happening? There's a lot of reasons around polarization, distrust of media, poor information environments, conspiracy theories, etc. But the nature of the race is this, basically, that going into the last 2 months of the campaign, it is completely plausible that Trump will still win even after that disastrous debate. But right now, Kamala Harris has a narrow edge, I would say. And I would also be less surprised if she won by several points than if Donald Trump won by several points. And the reason I suggest that is because what Harris did in the debate, and this is sort of the subtleties that maybe people outside the US aren't picking up on as much, is she is invoking a whole bunch of buzzwords that are aimed at appealing to Republican crossover voters, the kinds of people who might be lifelong Republicans, but have always sort of had a disdain for Donald Trump's temperament, his character, his abusive personality, etc. And so, she invoked the endorsement of Liz and Dick Cheney, people who are very different politically from Kamala Harris. She invoked John McCain's legacy, the former presidential candidate from 2008 who passed away a couple of years ago, who opposed some of Donald Trump's signature policies. And all of that was sort of tailor-made to say, we welcome you with open arms if you are a Republican who is not a Trump Republican. What Donald Trump did in the debate was he doubled down on every buzzword that exists in the Fox News universe and that really galvanizes his base, but he did nothing to appeal to people who don't like Donald Trump. And in fact, he took the bait repeatedly in the debate in ways that caused him to double down on his biggest political liabilities. So, I mean, what she did incredibly effectively was she understood that his narcissism is one of his biggest political weaknesses. And so the debate pivoted in about 90 seconds, where it started sort of even. And then all of a sudden, Kamala Harris makes a claim about his rallies, how nobody's coming to his rallies, his crowd sizes are small, and that people are leaving before he's even finished talking. And as soon as this happens, Trump starts to disintegrate. He makes this bizarre claim about immigrants eating dogs and cats. He talks about how he actually won the 2020 election, which doesn't grow his base. He talked about January 6th in defensive terms, basically saying that this was not so bad. And he doubled down on some of his older liabilities around race with things like calling for the death penalty for 5 innocent Black young men who were wrongfully accused of a vicious crime in Central Park. And so, what basically has happened now is that Kamala Harris will probably pick up 1 to 2 points in the polls as a result of the debate, precisely because a lot of undecided voters don't know her very well. Even though she is vice president, a lot of people don't know much about her. And as a result of that, there's this sort of introduction that's been happening in this campaign. The other point that I would make broader than the debate, before I wrap things up, is to say that Kamala Harris's transition from Biden to Harris has been one of the most masterful political orchestrations I have seen in my life. The 30 days between her candidacy beginning and the convention was effectively flawless. I mean, there were almost no negative stories. The debate was executed extremely well, and she's operating at a very high level. And so, that combined with some of the other X factors in this election around abortion politics, for example, which, has fundamentally changed a lot of dynamics in the United States, suggests to me that if I were a betting man today, I would bet on her winning. But I do not think that she's going to win in a 10-point victory. And I still think it's highly plausible that she could lose. So, it's a very fluid debate. It's going to be decided by probably 100,000 people in a few swing states. And that's ultimately, where the fate of the world sort of lies. And I'll just conclude by saying that some of the structural problems that have led us to this point, regardless of who wins, are still going to be there after November 5th. So the risks of political violence, if she wins, are enormous, especially before the inauguration, but also heading into her term if she were to be elected. The risks of political violence if Trump wins also exist. And the fundamentally broken aspects of American democracy that underlie all of this are going to persist no matter the result of the election. So I'll leave my bleak comments on that depressing note. But I think we're very much not out of the woods no matter what happens in the upcoming election in just under 2 months.
Bleak indeed, but very insightful nonetheless. And I'd love to come back later on the broken nature of American politics that you mentioned, because of course American voters still have to vote and international policymakers still have to deal with that country, even though there are those structural problems that you mentioned. So let's pick this up later. But for now, let me move over to Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, and perhaps you could help us to draw out some of the foreign policy lessons from the debate itself, and then and move things towards the transatlantic relationship. Over to you, Thomas.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. Thank you for inviting me here. How to pick up after bleak and depressing, as the words of the last sentence. I do want to pick up with one point about last night's debate, and then move on to a couple of foreign policy points that one can draw from this debate. My first point would be clearly Kamala Harris succeeded in this debate for all the reasons that Brian just mentioned. But it is still unclear whether that's enough to put her over the hump. The election, in my view, is still a coin toss. Yes, there was the post-election surveys that showed her clearly in historic margins ahead of Trump, 63 to 37. But I've looked up. Hillary Clinton won 62 to 27 over Trump in the first debate in 2016. Mitt Romney, 67 to 25 over then President Barack Obama in the first debate of 2012. So even a historic margin of that proportion doesn't guarantee you that this is a match winner. And even though this may be the major event that people tune into in this election campaign, and there are indications to that end, in those same surveys post-debate, Trump was still 20 points ahead on the economy and migration. So on these issues, he scored, or at least she wasn't able to close the gap. So her win might be about temperament, about readiness to be a president, which is good news. Just prior to the debate, it seemed early this week as if the ascent of Kamala Harris, as if she might have plateaued. First indications in polling seem to show that. Now, she clearly helped herself on a Tuesday night, but is it enough to close the deal? Is it enough to expand her base? It's clear that Donald Trump has a problem getting beyond 47, 48%. But so far, Kamala Harris hasn't moved above that either. So it's not just that she is ahead of him. She needs to be at 48, 49, 50%. Once you see that number, you can be more assured that she's closer to winning. And before the debate, she still hadn't fully reassembled the Obama alliance, the Obama coalition. There's still on the side of the Latinos, especially young man, where she is not fully into her potential. So there is still work to do. Clearly, the momentum is on her side. Clearly, she has helped her case. Clearly, this is hers to lose, but this is a coin toss. I just want to warn us, just as Brian did a minute ago. Second remark, I think the debate shows, and Jan asked to focus a bit on foreign policy and transatlantic relations. The transatlantic relations is no longer a raison d'etat, an unquestioned element of American foreign policy. But what we have seen in this debate, it's an element of American polarization, and it's an element of a fierce debate. And therefore, it is subject to electoral change, which is bad news for Europeans. It could change every 4 years. On Ukraine, Trump answered the question, whether he wanted Ukraine to win. He said, well, I want the war to end. And he did so in a very angry, probably most angry fashion in this whole debate, and that's saying something. It was only Harris that mentioned NATO. Trump just that he was so successful in getting Europeans to pay up. Trump dissed Germany in well-known fashion. So what I would say is that that this debate is a further indication of a highly polarized American foreign policy outlook, and the sort of the long-term reliability of the United States as a foreign policy partner is a question Europeans should ask themselves. You could even extend that not just to NATO and the Ukraine question, but even if you're a business person and you've come to like the Inflation Reduction Act because you want to invest in the United States, just imagine he just pulls the plug on that or changes it to an unrecognizable traditional energy promotion act, and changes the tax code, including the corporate tax. You might lose here, you might win there. So reliability of the United States in the long-term outlook for Europeans is an issue that clearly showed itself in this debate.
Mm-hmm.
My third and final point, as this debate shows, it's a Euro-idealistic fantasy to believe that a Trump victory will unite Europe. The opposite will be the case. It will deepen divisions inside Europe, and it will shift the power within Europe towards the populist right. There was an ode to Viktor Orban in this debate when he said he's not a strongman, but a strong man, and that's why they don't like him. So there's potential ripple effects for Europe in this. And some people claim and say, well, no matter who wins, we have to do the following, and it doesn't really matter that much to Europe whether this or the other candidate wins. I would say, well, look twice. It does matter, because the philosophical grounds on which they stand, especially on foreign policy, is very different, even if there are some policies, and that would probably refer to protectionism and a shifting burden for Europe on defense may look similar on the surface.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, this with your third point, you already answered the follow-up question that I would have asked you about potential silver linings of a Trump election for Europe getting its act together in terms of defense. But we can talk more about how to react from a European angle in the Q&A in a moment. But for now, let me move over to Rachel and ask what you will be looking at over the next weeks, and what are we to expect on November 5th and indeed the day after? How can anyone prepare, if at all, for the type of uncertainty that we're facing?
I really wish I knew what we could expect on November 5th. That would make my next few weeks a little more relaxed. To add to one of the statistics Thomas mentioned earlier, Romney, had a huge a win over Barack Obama in the first debate, and he got a 4-point bump in the polls after that, or Obama got a 4-point dip, however you want to look at it. And in the end, we know that Romney didn't win. So I think we should be watching the polls to see what this debate brought Kamala Harris. I think it's really important in the same way it was for Obama, but even more so because she's kind of introducing herself to a lot of people. And there were over 60 million viewers. That's 40 million more than tuned into the conventions, right? So this is by far the biggest stage she's going to get. Doesn't look right now like Trump's camp is going to sign up for another debate, meaning that was it for her, right? That's the last time she's going to get 60 million eyes on her. Americanized, because that's the sort of Nelson rating. So it's only looking at the American viewership. So I'll definitely be watching the polls to see, is this the beginning of a climb for Kamala Harris? Is it a bump that, will start to then recede? It's too close to call in almost all of the swing states. I mean, a small lead in Wisconsin and Michigan, but even those are basically within the margin of error. And I think it's, she's got a strategy of reaching out to new voters, as Brian mentioned. Trump doesn't. Trump's got a sort of activate the base strategy. So there is potential that she could really grow. And the next 4 weeks might show us that, right? And then you could end up with a scenario like Brian said, where she wins a like somewhat definitive victory. I'm not super certain about this strategy she's taken to sort of get those Republicans who are sick of Trump to come over to her. And there I find one statistic very worrying. In 2016, when Trump was still new and kind of worrying for Republican voters, 92% of Republicans voted for him. In 2020, when you knew what you were getting with Trump, 94% of Republicans voted for him. So there is also a thing there of people, don't want to be wrong, right? Do you want to have said you voted for the guy who was this dangerous, this crazy, twice? And so to a certain extent, I worry that Republicans, even the Republicans who think he's very problematic, and that's frankly most of them, are just locked in at this point. And it would be too much failure admitting on their part to kind of change their vote. That's my worry about the Harris strategy. But, she's got a lot of smart folks working for her who are more in the weeds in this than I am. So let's hope they're right. If I were them, I would be paying a lot of attention to Gen Z. In 2020, only 8% of Gen Z voted. Even more of those folks are old enough to vote in this election. And that's where you have tons of room to grow. We'll see. There were over 300,000 clicks on the Taylor Swift link to vote.gov. So 300,000 is a pretty big number, and that was just the first night. So if they can sort of get a kind of activation of younger voters, this could be the change that the Harris campaign needs. She hasn't done a great job of, she's winning women by a huge margin. People are calling it now a gender chasm because she's got a 13% lead over women and about a 5% deficit in getting the male vote. So she needs to kind of stop the bleeding there. Waltz was obviously meant to help in that regard. But I didn't see kind of any active outreach to younger men in the debate. Lots of outreach to sort of, older Biden Trump voters. But she's not kind of actively reaching out to younger men. So we'll see if she kind of looks in that direction. In terms of foreign policy, I agree with everything Thomas said. The more I hear Kamala Harris talk about foreign policy, the more she sounds a lot more like Biden than Obama. And that is probably a really good short-term thing for Europeans. By this I mean, and part of it was Biden was surrounded by a lot of foreign policy outsiders, and they thought they were much smarter than the foreign policy establishment. And you don't get that vibe with Harris. Harris has foreign policy insiders. She's got the Biden team around her, a lot of traditionalists, and every tone she's struck on foreign policy thus far has been kind of very transatlanticist, American leadership traditionalist. So that's good for Germany and Europe if it's a Harris victory. But as Thomas said, there's no indication that American leadership and transatlanticism is a bipartisan feature anymore of American And this this is a problem for all of American allies. And the last thing I'll note on this is maybe this is a silver lining if Trump wins for smart actors. I mean, there was a very clear demonstration last night of how manipulable Donald Trump is. Every single small provocation that Harris put out there for him, he took. And so if I were, you know, in office of someone who has to deal with American foreign policy, that would be something I'd be thinking about in terms of preparing for a Trump victory. I mean, all of the other good stuff that people should be praying in terms of self-sufficiency, in terms of, you know, building other kinds of partnerships, alliances, planning ahead, but also he appears to be slightly malleable. So if you go at it in a smart way, you might be able to get more concessions from him than he would be aware of or planning for.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So despite all of the uncertainties that all of you laid out, there's also some more certainty. We know about Project 2025. We know about plans in the Trump camp of filling bureaucratic posts much more quickly this time and with somewhat clearer policies in mind than the last time round. So perhaps you could say a few words about what to expect from a potential Trump 2 administration, but also, and we're really looking at foreign policy here now and transatlantic relations, but also beyond the transatlantic realm, what to expect differently of a Harris administration as opposed to Biden. So some observers have seen nuances of differences there, and I wonder if you could draw those out a little more. This is also, I think, picking up one of our first questions in the chat, which is essentially what Europeans and what the rest of the world can really expect of a Harris victory in terms of foreign policy. So let me also invite more questions from the audience. I see a first hand raised, but I think there's enough questions for now. Let's do one more quick round of responses, and feel free to also pick up one another's comments. We'll do Brian, Thomas, Rachel. And then after that, I'll pick up Thomas O'Donnell's question. Over to you, Brian.
Great, thank you. So yes, on the domestic front, I mean, I think there's some pretty worrying stuff happening. And a lot of this doesn't make international news, but if you pay attention to what's going on in the weeds, the people that Donald Trump is surrounding himself with are genuinely dangerous zealots. One of the reasons why the campaign debate was so disastrous for Trump, I think, was because the people who prepared him were not serious people. One of the people involved in the preparation is this woman that you may never have heard of called Laura Loomer, who also accompanied him to the 9/11 memorial yesterday and flew on his plane. She describes herself as a white nationalist. She laments that America has become a diverse place and describes it as a Christian ethno-state. She's a conspiracy theorist who believes the U.S. government did 9/11. This is who he took to the 9/11 memorial yesterday. So, you know, there's this sort of aspect of looking at Donald Trump from the outside, especially for those who are not following the minutia of the campaign, and wrongly assuming that Trump 1.0 is a good preview for Trump 2.0. That's a very big mistake, in my opinion. It's going to be a very different thing if he gets reelected. And the reason for that is because the Republican Party has fundamentally changed. In 2017, there were genuine guardrails on Donald Trump. He faced a different Supreme Court that actually would have constrained him. He faced people in Congress who voted against him. John McCain famously torpedoed his health care bill. And many of the people who stood up to Trump, who condemned him in 2017, either were ousted from the party or have died. And so those people are gone. And everybody else who remains in the Republican Party now has become a Trump disciple. And this is the answer that I would give to Rachel's point about the 92 to 94% switch. Who is a Republican is now different. The people who are the never Trumpers identified as Republicans still in 2016. They don't identify as Republicans in 2024. And so what you have is a smaller group of people who are self-identified partisans who are more and more devoted to an extreme ideology, which itself in Trump's mind has become more extreme. If you look at his posts on Truth Social in 2024, they make the stuff from 2017 look extremely normal and tame. So I think one of the biggest category errors that people make when they look at Trump now is thinking that it will just be like 2017 to 2021. And I think that's completely wrong. The administration would be driven largely by vengeance. He has an existential risk to his personal freedom because he might go to jail if he loses. And I think he feels like his mistake in 2020, or sorry, in 2021 going into January 6th was that he was too tepid. So the risks are enormous, I think, and the possibility of him attempting to withdraw from NATO, I think, is not zero. I think that it's I don't know whether it will happen. I think there will be some pushback to that from the Republican establishment, but I think it's a possibility that this could be something he attempts during a second term. On the Harris aspects of this, I mean, I think, one of the reasons why Harris looks like Biden, in my view, on foreign policy is simply a byproduct of events, right? I mean, Obama had all of this pivot to Asia type stuff, and, let's get out of the Middle East, let's pivot away from Europe. The biggest foreign policy problems that the US is facing in the world are, of course, the rise of China on the one hand, and that will dominate foreign policy for a Harris administration or a Trump administration. But the events that are creating news are in the Middle East and in Europe, I mean, with Ukraine and Gaza. And so I think it's very difficult to read tea leaves in any significant way or influential way, particularly because Harris is part of the Biden administration still, and she can't really directly challenge her boss without creating headlines. So I would say it's basically impossible to know what Harris will do in foreign policy at this stage. But my big warning is do not believe that Trump 1.0 is a good indicator of what Trump 2.0 would do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. What do you think, Thomas?
Unfortunately, I have to agree with Brian that, and I like his term, it's a category error to understand Trump 2 as Trump 1. There is a well-known essay by Fiona Hill just after the election in 2020, when she described the mechanisms of a self-coup in the Atlantic magazine, and showed that the measures that Trump took to prevent the peaceful transfer of power in 2021 are very similar to the classic elements of a self-coup. And the most important one of them is to exchange the Secretary of Defense against an incapable loyalist, even after he had lost the election, because he wanted to take control of the military. So what we will be seeing is trying to get control of the judiciary, trying to influence the media. The Supreme Court already has shifted in his direction, and we see that in the immunity case. So this is classic. This will be a classic right-wing nationalist playbook that we will see with a democratic decline in the quality of democracy in the United States. So category error seems to be exactly the right term. But I want to make one remark on foreign policy. My biggest concern, and maybe that is a way to answer Milutin's question in the chat, is his approach to the Ukraine, to Ukraine. Now, he has claimed he will end the war in 24 hours. Now he has mediated that claim and says he will end the war before he takes office. What he might do is a summit with Putin, two big men steering the world, just what Putin, sort of Helsinki style, just what Putin would like. And that his goal is to disaggregate the Russian-Chinese relationship alliance at the expense of Ukraine and Europe. And we already see indications of that. He's already mentioned that, give Eastern Europe to the wolves. His quotes on that are well known. So from a European standpoint, this is the biggest danger. And foreign policy in preparing for Trump will need to prepare for that moment. In my view, to start getting a contact group to agree with Zelensky on conditions of that. So to preempt a Trump-Putin version of an agreement over the heads of those concerned.
Rachel, do you want to come in as well?
Sure. I mean, on the change in degree significantly in a Trump 2.0, I agree completely. I also agree with Thomas that the Europeans should be getting together with Kyiv and working out contingency plans of, you know, how they can help Zelensky resist pressure, and that it would be good then also for the Europeans to, you know, think about their part in that and have something ready. Whether or not Trump withdraws from NATO, I think we also have to be honest about the fact of NATO deterrence is 90% the US. So I think you also have to think seriously about how do you make the European side of deterrence something serious. So this is related also to the, you know, preparing with Zelensky. So these are things that, and by the way, these are things that would be more or less welcomed by a Harris administration as well. So these are not things that are going to shoot you in the foot if the wrong person wins. And so on the foreign policy front, I think that's exactly right. You know, in broad strokes, I think also in the German context, because politics are developing, you know, in a somewhat similar direction potentially in Germany, like in lots of places in West Europe. I mean, you really have to think about the gatekeeping failure that happened on the Republican side in this, you know, and what were the steps that led us to where we are now with this calcified polarization. And I think, you know, the two-party system and all of that is unique, but a lot of the mechanisms and guardrails that you would have to have in place and sacrifices that parties would be needing to be willing to make are very similar.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I do want to come back to the specific steps that European governments should take as a precaution mechanism, regardless of who wins the election later on. But for now, let me pick up Tom O'Donnell's question, who's raised his hand for a while. If you could introduce yourself and pose your question to one or several panelists.
Hi, yeah, I'm Tom O'Donnell. I work in energy and geopolitics. I'm with the Wilson Center in Washington, but I also teach on energy and transitions here at FU every other semester or so. What I wanted to put to the panel, well, at first I especially wanted to put it to Brian, but in the discussion, the thing is, we're talking about this, what went on between Harris and Trump, but what I don't seem to get a sense of here is recognition of how deep the problems that the American people see are, the average voter are, and why Trump worked so well. I mean, I'll just say three things quick: migration, inflation and cost of living, but also the fact that he raised the name of Germany on energy issues. These are all things, these are tropes. I mean, he doesn't have to describe policy. She goes on about something that, yeah, maybe whatever, and he just has to raise a trope, cats and dogs. Look, I talked to, I don't want to take much time, but I talked to an African-American activist, an older guy in Washington I've known for years on the Northeast side in the ghetto. He hates Trump. As soon as I mentioned this, he went on for 20 minutes about how Venezuelan immigrants are taking over the whole community, taking all the jobs, and about the high cost of inflation, and Harris doesn't get it either. I did the same thing with somebody in Buffalo, New York, who hates Trump, a white woman who worked for years with the Democrats. Yeah, all the hotels are occupied by immigrants. I can't afford my groceries anymore. So, you know, what is Harris's solution? And Trump hit on something. In the 2020 election, she was clearly, in an embarrassing way, hunting for policies. She didn't know what to say. And she's still being very careful. But she doesn't have tropes to oppose his tropes, okay? And so, anyway, the thing of mentioning Germany, I've taught mainly American students who come over for a number of years on energy matters and energy transition at FU. And nobody has any illusions anymore. They think when you say Germany, the idea of crazy and energy comes right to people's mind in the sense that, yeah, they shut off the nuclear plants. They were relying on Putin. Now they're begging us and the Qataris for LNG, and building plants. He just needs to say these tropes. And the Foreign Office fell right into it, of course. So, yeah, I hope Harris wins, but this should have been done democratically a long time ago. So there was a real policy debate and a real primary, and this could have been evolved much better, but in my opinion. So I'd like to, if you guys could just talk, or Rachel, talk about this a little bit, this aspect.
Okay, let's move to Brian first.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for your comments. I mean, I think, of course, there's deep disdain for some aspects of the Biden administration in at least certain elements of the public. And there are serious concerns about the border, which is, I mean, it's a real problem. And it's a political liability for Harris. One thing she did in the debate that I think is effective, and it depends on how much this cuts through or not, is it is true that basically what happened, I mean, she described this in her answer, was that the Biden administration basically said to Republican members of Congress, extremely conservative members of Congress, what do you want? And jointly wrote a bill, which Donald Trump then killed because he said he wanted migration to be a key issue in the election. And so depending on how much that information gets out, I mean, I think that's important, as well as the fact that immigration is now coming down relative to extreme highs several months ago. I'll pick up on a couple points. I mean, one is, I think this idea, I disagree with you on one thing, which is that if he just mentions the tropes, then that's enough. And the reason I say that is because when you watch the debate, if you follow this stuff closely in the Fox News universe, you know what he's talking about all the time. Because all the tropes are the things that Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity and all these sort of right-wing, very influential media figures discuss. If you don't, which is true for the majority of sort of ordinary voters who don't live and breathe politics, you have no idea what he's talking about when he mentions these tropes. And the cat and dog thing is just utterly bizarre, right? I mean, it was a huge mistake because ordinary people do not believe that immigrants come into various communities and abduct their pets and eat them, right? It plays into every aspect of Trump's political liabilities that he's an extreme weirdo, which is what the Harris campaign is painting him as. The final thing I'll say, and I'm going to basically alienate probably everyone in the audience now, I don't agree with you on the Germany aspect. And the reason I don't is because I don't think that more than 1% of American voters know anything about German energy policy. I don't think that more than 1% of voters are going to care at all about anything in this election on foreign policy, other than occasionally throwing out things about, oh, we want peace again, right? When right-wing voters will sometimes say, well, when Trump was in charge, we didn't have all these wars. But the depth of understanding on American foreign policy or the importance of that debate to this election is, in my view, negligible. I do not think that almost anyone is voting on foreign policy, which has been true in American politics in almost every presidential election, except for certain pivotal ones like around the Iraq War and so on. So where the U.S. is really, really implicated in things like terrorism risk and so on around 9/11. So, I think this is fundamentally going to pivot on a few issues. Inflation and the border are certainly among them, but I also think abortion politics will be crucial, and temperament and values are going to be crucial in the election. And Harris did everything she possibly could on those latter fronts. But yes, she does have political liabilities with the border and with the economy.
Thanks, Brian. Allow me to ask a brief follow-up to you before we move on to the others, because you said that Germany doesn't rank very highly on the key election drivers among the Americans. I have to I have to ask why you think it is that foreign policy actually ranks higher on the importance scale with Trump supporters than it does with Harris supporters. And in general, I think it's somewhat higher in this election than in previous ones. So maybe you can say just a word about this trend.
Yeah, I think this is sort of an illusion. When you ask Trump voters about foreign policy, they will say a version of the same sort of sentence. Back when he was in charge, we didn't have all these wars. You ask them about Ukraine, and they'll say something like, "We want the war to end," right? Or Zelensky is a troublemaker. They'll say stuff like this because a lot of in the right wing sort of podcast sphere, Zelensky is the bad guy and Putin is not, right? And there was recently a Department of Justice case that came out that showed that the Russian government was basically paying several of these extremely influential podcasters $100,000 an episode to talk about how Zelensky is the biggest threat to American security, right? So, I mean, there's stuff going on in the background that is very disturbing. I mean, I have gone on MSNBC and CNN like literally hundreds of times. And the only time we talk about foreign policy ever is if a US president directly makes a speech about it or goes abroad. Otherwise, the world is invisible. Americans do not talk about foreign policy in their domestic politics unless it is a direct implication tied to a American political actor. And it's a really striking thing. If you haven't done this when you go to the US, just watch Fox News or watch MSNBC or CNN. 95+% of the coverage is about American political roller coasters, and that's it. It's an extremely insular domestic political environment. And, you know, I just don't believe that foreign policy will play any sort of major role in this contest for most voters.
Thomas, over to you.
I thought Tom's remark was really valuable to point us into one important direction. We tend to look at the bizarre character that is Donald Trump, and the dangers emanating from him being in power. But we tend to overlook that there is real grievance with a large part of the population that hasn't gone away in the last 8 years and is not likely to go away even if he loses. So the question then becomes, how do you address those grievances? And unless Western societies find a way to do that, and we haven't in the last 8 years, that movement is strong and going strong in Europe as well. And until that moment, we will not have a sort of a stable foreign policy outlook, a joined an alliance that is reliable. So that is important beyond our domestic spaces. There's one a question obviously relating to the Republican Party. Assume Donald Trump loses. What happens to the Republican Party? My guess would be that there would be some version of a civil war. There would be those who would be with Steve Bannon, who once famously said that Donald Trump is an imperfect medium of nationalist populism, which would suggest to you that a better medium would need to be found following Donald Trump, or whether having lost a series of elections convinces folks in the Republican Party that is not a winning strategy, and that republicanism needs to return to a more classic conservatism. I think that debate is ahead of us, and the debate on how to address the grievances is ahead of all of us.
Rachel.
So on Thomas's point about the real grievances, and I frankly think this was the biggest failing of Kamala Harris in the debate. She missed a couple opportunities to talk like a real person. She had like political answers for these things, and didn't even kind of, it just takes one sentence to at least acknowledge, like, I understand the pain in a real way. The challenge that she has, which is the challenge that all sort of serious truth-telling politicians have, is the answers to these things are not easy. So you're up against someone who's promising, I'm going to end the Ukraine war in a day. I'm going to, and people who aren't following the facts of these things think that sounds great, and a real answer of how to bring down inflation is just difficult, right? I mean, the truth is these things are global things. There's a lot of factors. We have been trying, but she could have said 2 years ago, inflation was 9.5%. And that is way too high. And yes, that was because of a global pandemic, and people are still feeling the pain of the 9%. And we've gotten it down to 2.5%. And she could have compared, at the end of Trump, it was close to 2% with an unemployment rate of whatever. And we have just over 2% and an unemployment rate. I mean, she could have dropped a few facts to be like, but the thing that she should have done and didn't was to sort of seriously acknowledge the pain in a more honest and direct way. The problem that she has is she can't say, or she won't say, because she's, not a populist liar. And in week 2 of my presidency, I'm going to get inflation down to 1.8%, and by the magic of whatever. And this is really the problem that serious politicians have facing off populists, right? And I don't know the answers to that, except for that I do think a bit of kind of just common honesty connection, which was, for example, something Barack Obama did very well, I think that really helps. And she failed on that account. Also, she got the opportunity to, she was asked about the Afghanistan withdrawal. And the main substance of her answer was correct, which was, Trump wanted to withdraw, Obama wanted to withdraw, Biden was the one who actually did it. But how hard is it to say, yes, that withdrawal was disastrous. And it was, really a shame that it went that way. And then you say the sort of political answer. But this politician thing of, we can't admit mistakes and we can't do a little bit of straight talk, I think is a real mistake. I wish the Democrats would have learned from Trump that, you can be a bit imperfect if you're connecting in a real way. I saw also there's a question about Israel Gaza. That is a foreign policy issue. And this is where I'm slightly worried. I thought Harris did better in the debate than she did in her interview about trying to hit both camps with the sort of young pro-Palestinian voters who are, for example, in places like Michigan, pretty important, while not alienating the more pro-Israeli voters. But it is an issue. It's an issue that so far is still costing her younger voters and Arab American voters. And she got a huge bump from Biden. People believe a little bit more that she cares about the Palestinians, but it's a difficult issue for her.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Brian. Did you want to react to the question in the chat about the Gaza conflict, especially looking at young voters and Muslim communities in swing states? Is that having an effect? What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. This would have been something that was a major political liability for Biden. It remains a political liability for Harris. I think it's been somewhat canceled out because the energy among young people, and I take Rachel's point about the debate that there was no outreach to young men, but there is a very significant field outreach on TikTok and with young influencers, not to mention celebrity outreach and so on. And I think that there is, I think there's been a bigger gain in young voters from the switch from Biden to Harris than there would be a loss from the Democratic base on the Gaza issue. And I also think she has threaded that needle more effectively than Biden has. It matters, right? But there's also a lot of young people who I don't think they're diverting to Trump. I think that they are simply going to not vote, which already was a risk, right? There's a lot of politically disengaged young people in the United States as well. So even if turnout is high in this race, we're looking at 6 out of 10 Americans who vote, probably something like that, right? It's usually 60 to 65% turnout is a high turnout election. So, and among young people, it's way lower numbers. I don't think it will be decisive in most states other than possibly Michigan, and that's perhaps or arguably the place where she's strongest at the moment of the 6 most crucial swing states. So I'm not suggesting that foreign policy is meaningless. I'm just saying that in the grand scheme of things, I do not think it will be the decisive issue that when we sort of dissect what happened in this election, that will point to foreign policy as the decisive factor.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. We are actually also already coming to an end of our 1 hour discussion here. So I wanted to ask a round of closing questions, and my closing question is, if you were to address the German Federal Foreign Office, perhaps there's even a representative here in the audience, what are the specific steps that you would recommend, the kind of precautions that the German government could take, things that could be moved? And perhaps I could weave in a question by Felix Christian Haas, because this is essentially the mirror question on the business side of things, because he's saying that the private sector has been rather passive in mode, and what could German industry do to prepare for what's to come from the American industrial policy after this election? So let's go in reverse order for a set of closing remarks. Feel free to pick up those questions others asked or anything else that you think is left unanswered. So we'll start with Rachel this time, then Thomas, and end with Brian. Over to you, Rachel.
Well, I actually am working on some scenario exercises that are trying to get exactly at that. And the problem being, I mean, talking to the Foreign Office is easier than taking a European view, because it turns out European politics are pretty complicated to get everyone together to have an answer, as Thomas also said, right? There's, you know, either way, there's no guarantee that you're going to get some kind of like European initiative and unity. So the main advice for the board, I mean, there's the specific advice of like, try to build your networks, try to, you know, figure out who has influence, especially in the Trump world, although that's a difficult game, you know, these kind of practical things. But on a more fundamental level, and this has been my advice for the last 10 years and will probably continue to be my advice, it's just slightly more dramatic now, which is, you know, try to be more self-sufficient, right? Think about your own security in the context of the world, and stop pretending that, you know, all security demands are being forced on you by the United States, right? Germany has security interests. Maybe they think a China-led world is a great and safe world for German industry, but maybe they also have their own ideas about these things, and they need to build up the strategic thought and then try to do the political communication and leadership to communicate that to the people. And the German public is miles from where they were 2 years ago on this. So the door is wide open if there's political leadership, which I understand is difficult. But
Thank you. Thomas, it looks like you're taking notes and you're writing a long list of what's left to do for the German government and German industry. What is it?
I wish. I mean, 4 many points. One, stop digging. The last night's tweet by the German Foreign Office is, I mean, I want to put it diplomatically, unfortunate, to give Rick Grenell an opening to seek vengeance. Stop digging. Second, along the lines of my previous argument, prepare for a declining American support of Ukraine. One thing we haven't talked about is the outcome of the congressional part of the election. No matter who wins the presidential election, it is very likely that we will see a divided Congress. And the likelihood of the next, even with a Kamala Harris support of NATO and of Zelensky, to see the next American support package is hard to see. Now, that can go to the extreme that if Trump wins, we're in the scenario that I described in my previous interventions. So preparing for that and making a decision as to whether the Europe is prepared to step into the role and in the end buy American arms to support Ukraine is a debate that Europeans have been ducking, and our financial debate in this country doesn't bode well for the outcome of that debate. The third argument would be a truism. We need to be stronger on defense in any outcome, and Rachel just mentioned it, not to please any American president, but to follow the German national interest. And that is what is at stake here. And that is unconnected to any outcome of any foreign election. Industry, the question of what can industry do? Well, do prepare for a competitive world, a competitive world order, which again, you will see no matter what the outcome of that election is, it will take a different shape within a competitive world depending on the outcome, but it will be unlikely to be the multipolar world that some in this country project, including the Chancellor in his foreword to the national security strategy. That seems to me is not the outcome that if you analyze global order, is where we're headed, and that may have and will have consequences for industry as well.
Thank you. Brian, you have very little time left, but please help us to wrap things up.
Yeah, I'm aware of time, so I'll just say two quick points very briefly. I would say, I would echo the comments about amplifying leadership within Europe and also preparing for the worst. I mean, have a plan for if Trump tries to either withdraw from NATO or simply end all American support for Ukraine quickly, because it's possible. It's not necessarily likely in the first month, but it is certainly possible. And the second piece of advice I'd give that hasn't been said is for industry, work with states, because states are still major players. And, the state of California is going to behave differently from the federal government under a Trump 2.0 industry. And it's a huge economy. So you can still have lots and lots of involvement in America if you go through state governments, even if the federal government is significantly less receptive to German interests.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers, to you in the audience for tuning in. This was really interesting and could have easily gone on for another hour, but I'm afraid we have to close for now. We will be back with our morning briefing series next Thursday, talking about German migration policy, which is also high on the agenda at the moment. But for now, thanks to all of you here and to our team. Have a lovely day despite the turbulent political times, and see you soon at the German Council of Foreign Relations. Bye-bye.